Welcome back to The Truth About the Market. I'm Jason Zilberbrand, president of VREF, longtime aviation appraiser, and someone who has spent over 3 decades deep inside this industry. I've worked with everyone from celebrity owners to Fortune 50 flight departments. I've testified as an expert witness in federal court, and I've seen more market cycles than I can count. And today, we are going to tackle one of the most polarizing subjects in aviation. Well, actually, we're going to tackle 3 of them. Off-market aircraft, back-to-backs, and why a broker is still essential in 2025. 2 words no ethical broker should ever entertain, yet everyone does: off-market. It's the whispered promise of access, the illusion of exclusivity. It's the idea that you've beaten the system. But here's the question. If it's so good, why does it almost always go bad? Today, I'm pulling back the curtain on aviation's dirtiest open secret, the off-market transaction. In this episode, we're going to break down the good, the bad, and the ugly of off-market transactions. We're going to examine the notorious back-to-back structure and explain why a broker is not just a convenience, but a necessity. So, let's talk about the good. Off-market deals do have a genuine advantage. Well, they have a couple. The first is exclusivity. Some of the best aircraft never make it to public listing sites like Controller or Trade-A-Plane. They change hands quietly through networks of trust. A Gulfstream may move from one Fortune 100 flight department to another without ever being publicly advertised. More often than not, it trades from one chairman to another. After all, people who travel in the same circles often ask friends for advice, referrals, and yes, at this level, aircraft and yacht purchase advice is very common. The second reason they have an advantage is speed, right? So without the noise of public listings and tire kickers, serious buyers can close faster. When a trusted broker tells you an airplane is available, you're already at the front of the line. Off-market aircraft have an aura of being special. It's better than what's out there. They're not picked through, it's the perfect spec, and always an amazing pedigree. Third, confidentiality. High-profile individuals and corporations often want transactions shielded from the public eye. Off-market deals protect privacy, reputations, and business strategies. It also keeps the pilots who are either finding out the plane is for sale or from keeping them from telling the world that it's for sale. And a lot of times, if a company is selling an aircraft, the pilots might be let go. So there's another reason for an off-market aircraft. But this is where a skilled broker shines, right? So a good broker isn't just pushing listings. They know which aircraft owners are serious. They know which airplanes are coming out of an inspection. They know which deals truly represent value. They can cut through the noise. They can deliver an actual access to an aircraft that is not publicly listed. If you have a list of real buyers and a list of real aircraft that are truly for sale, you can play matchmaker and not spend countless hours dealing with so-called buyers asking the same questions that indicate that they are anything but. All right, so if an off-market listing is so appealing, why do so many alphabet organizations frown upon them? Why do so many brokers publicly detest the off-market listing? Well, it's because off-market aircraft transactions get murky quick. The first issue is price transparency. Without public listings or market visibility, a buyer may not have a clue who they're dealing with. And to make matters worse, most of the time the price is make offer. So sellers may just have to use make an offer approach to inflate value beyond fair market range or to pay a number of people who get in the middle of your deal, right? So sellers create a lot of this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. The second issue is transparency. So if you look, you'll see off-market deals floating around the internet. You'll even see them in Controller. You'll find a spec sheet. There'll be a file of photo, no serial numbers, no tail numbers. You might even find the same aircraft being represented by numerous brokers, and they all claim exclusivity, and none of them have it. And this is the big problem with off-market aircraft. It creates a bunch of obstacles. And trust me, when I say I've seen it all, you got to remember, I was an inventory dealer for well over a decade. And I used to see my own aircraft that I owned and was selling for resale purposes listed by other brokers. So if it could happen to me, it can happen to anybody. The third is the due diligence issue. And it's because a lot of off-market aircraft are also back-to-back transactions, right? And a back-to-back is there's two transactions occurring simultaneously. So you got to remember, escrow needs to track this mess. And as a buyer, you have no clue until it's too late who has the vested interest in the aircraft you're buying, who actually owns it. When you play with off-market aircraft, you risk closing becoming an ethical nightmare for escrow. And I'm going to talk more about that later because it's a much more serious issue, I think, than a lot of people realize. Finally, timing. In a hot market, the fear of missing out drives irrational decision-making. Buyers chase off-market aircraft often because they lack the knowledge and they lack the experience to know when to walk away from a less than transparent situation. And it always begs the question, why do intelligent and wealthy people fall for this? Well, one word, vanity. It reminds me actually of one of the oldest car sales tricks in the books. And before COVID and before the internet sold cars and there was no salesperson involved, a sales guy who was often pushy, often obnoxious, but some of them figured out an easy way to sell a car. They'd give it to you for the weekend. You'd park it in front of your house. Your neighbors would look at it. They would compliment you on it. And come Monday, you weren't giving it back. Vanity. That's what allows people to fall into this trap. In all honesty, only a few situations make off-market listings legit. Remember, again, I was an inventory broker, and that's why I'm asking you to pay attention to this. So let's talk about the ugly, because when it gets ugly, it gets real ugly. And off-market transactions attract fraudsters. They attract opportunists. I've seen fraudulent mandates where someone claimed to represent a seller but had no authority. I've seen buyers wire millions of dollars outside of escrow only to watch the money disappear. Aircraft with hidden damage are another nightmare. You got gear up landings that are fixed or maybe not properly. You've got undisclosed corrosion becoming a huge problem. Logbooks altered, logbooks missing, liens, tax issues, international title complications, the international registry issues. The ugly becomes real. I've seen people try and close on an aircraft that the seller wasn't even selling. And if you're wondering how this happens, it's because there's no regulations governing or overseeing aircraft transactions. In fact, as a consumer, you have more protection when you buy a car or even a dishwasher than when you buy an airplane, because an aircraft broker or salesman has no license. There's no standards. There's no templates. There's no standardized purchase agreements. And this problem isn't new. In fact, it dates back to the very origins of aviation. After their first flights, did you know that the Wright brothers became tangled in a web of patent disputes, fraudulent representatives, and legal fights over who had the right to sell their aircraft? Multiple brokers and agents claimed exclusive rights to market Wright brothers aircraft. Many buyers thought they were buying directly from the Wrights, only to find themselves in disputes, overpaying, or receiving machines that weren't what was promised. The Wright company spent years in litigation chasing imposters, trying to protect its brand. And the lesson's clear, folks. Confusion over representation and hidden markups has been part of aviation since day one. It's in our fabric. Today's back-to-back arrangements are the modern version of that chaos. Too many middlemen, too little transparency, and enormous risk for both buyers and sellers. We built this show for people who live and breathe aviation. Brokers, lenders, appraisers, operators, buyers, sellers. If that's you, join the conversation. Your feedback shapes these episodes. Send me your questions or topics you want unpacked at jason@vref.com. They might make it into one of our next shows. So, I'm sure you're wondering, if you don't know, what is a back-to-back? And why isn't it illegal? Well, that's a good question. So, back-to-backs are one of the most misunderstood structures in aviation. A back-to-back deal occurs when a broker or an intermediary buys an aircraft on paper and immediately resells it to the actual buyer. And that's usually on the same day, usually at a simultaneous closing. This creates a buffer between buyer and seller, and it's often used for confidentiality. More often, it's used to hide commissions. And way or more often than not, the seller creates or allows the back-to-back because they either refuse to pay a commission to the brokers or they're way too trusting with their broker. And after all, many sellers will say, get me my number. I don't care what you do. The truth is that kind of opens up Pandora's box. So back-to-backs have benefits. So let's talk about a couple of them. First of all, sellers may not want the market to know what they've sold, and buyers may value that kind of discretion. But the risks are far greater, right? So a $10 million jet can be bought by a broker at that price and then flipped to a buyer at 12.5, and the buyer never realized that they overpaid. And the lack of transparency is the danger, right? So who does the broker represent? That's the question in a back-to-back. Who has fiduciary duty to the buyer? What protections exist if something goes wrong? And we've talked about this so many times on these podcasts. Murphy's Law is at play here. Anything that can go wrong usually will. And in the nature of a back-to-back transaction, because you do have two transactions going simultaneously, parallel, if you will, the purchaser who then flips it to the seller, they have to have the exact same terms in their contract that the end purchaser does. So all of a sudden, it's a tightrope. If anything occurs, it opens up the door for someone not to be able to meet their obligations. And if something really bad occurs, the end buyer may not know until it's too late because the middlemen fear that they would walk. So, it leaves people with deposits. They don't know who rightfully has them. Escrow doesn't really know who they're dealing with. And so, transparency really is the issue here. And I want to talk about, some case studies, because case studies show buyers saddled with aircraft that had missing records or hidden liens or title disputes because the broker only owned the airplane on paper and left that buyer exposed. Legal disputes can drag on for years. And I want you to hear that. It is not quick. People think that they can sue. It's in, it's out, and over with. Let me tell you the truth. It takes years. Sometimes it can take a decade. Legal disputes is not a way to solve a bad transaction. Not getting involved in it from the get-go is a way to not do it at all, right? So you have to have your guard up. Think about it. If you're a buyer in a back-to-back, who do you sue? The seller, who was a broker that took ownership for a minute and may not even be collectible? You're not buying it from the original owner, who's some wealthy guy. You may be dealing with a broker who maybe this is their only deal they did this year. So you got to really understand the dangers. Back-to-backs can also distort the market. They inflate prices artificially. They create an illusion of scarcity, and they undermine appraisals. And from a USPAP perspective, right, the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practices, that's the governing body for appraisers, they obscure true transaction prices. I can't tell you how many times I know it's a back-to-back, and I see these, comps floating around, and the real number is lower than what's being reported. And I know that because I talked to the manufacturer who was involved in the trade-in. So, at the end of the day, you got to be really careful about what you're dealing with. A back-to-back, it obscures, and it obscures the true transaction price, but it also corrupts comparables and damage transparency for that matter. So that said, there are rare cases when a back-to-back can solve a legitimate problem, right? So let's talk about that. And it's when it's handled by a reputable broker or reputable brokers, and this is the key, with full disclosure. Everybody has to know it's a back-to-back. The buyer, the seller, escrow. I've seen a number of deals close with a back-to-back in place because, A, none of the parties involved wanted to pay a commission. So this created a situation where both the buyer and seller were aware, and then, yes, the deal closed. But those cases are the exception. They're not the rule. If you hear back-to-back, your guard should go up immediately. And if you think that sounds theoretical, well, let's talk about a real-world example. This really happened. In 2024, well, it started a long time before that, but finally in 2024, the U.S. Department of Justice did convict an Oklahoma City woman for running a multi-million-dollar drug trafficking and money laundering operation. What was her method? Good question. a web of back-to-back aircraft deals designed to look like legitimate sales. She cycled airplanes through shell companies, buying and reselling on paper within days to disguise the origin of narcotics proceeds. So the DOJ, they traced the millions through those transactions, proving how easy it is not only to weaponize off-market structures, but just how opaque this is, right? So that's the dark side of back-to-backs. Look, without transparency, a deal that looks routine can turn into a federal case. Compliance isn't just red tape, it's protection. And this is the perfect segue to our next topic, why you need a broker. So why do you still need a broker? Because a good broker is your shield. They verify mandates. They confirm sellers are real. They negotiate without emotion. And they protect you from overpaying. And the insured due diligence isn't skipped. Yes, they get paid. They get a commission. But trust me when I tell you they earn it. Brokers work really hard in this industry. People don't realize, being an aviation salesman, it's not a 9 to 5. It's usually 7 days a week. It's holidays. It's nights. You wind up sacrificing time with your family to answer phones and running around and traveling to show aircraft. A good broker, they just don't have access to off-market aircraft that you never see online. They can do things differently, right? So let's take the picky buyer. Someone who needs a specialized spec or a specialized floor plan. This may be your best bet because they're going to go the extra mile. They're going to find what you're looking for. They may already know it exists, and that says a lot. When you hire a broker, you really should hire a specialist with whatever field you're going into, with whichever niche, whatever cabin class, whichever model, however way you want to look at it. But I like hiring, the best in their field. They have access to information. So, a good broker, they insist on independent appraisers. They do it because the data isn't just a gut feeling. They should guide value, and when a bank needs to finance your purchase, they know that it's above board. It's full transparency. It's the only way. It really is. So, a good broker, they protect the transaction, the mechanics of the deal, escrow, contracts, compliance. Without this, you're exposed to unnecessary risk. I always tell buyers to be careful when the broker is also the appraiser. He's also doing the back-to-back, and he's made the introduction to the lender, right? These are deals that wind up in court and eventually on my desk. It's the very ugly side of our industry where greed gets in the way of fiduciary, where a broker can't accept that they have a role to protect their client. So how can you protect yourself? Well, one, mandate the contract with the broker forces them to assign other duties to a third party, including pre-buy oversight, legal oversight, financial oversight, and yes, appraising and any lending oversight. It keeps the broker honest, and it keeps you in the driver's seat, and it makes sure that they are protecting that fiduciary relationship with you. So what are the takeaways here? Well, off-market and back-to-back deals aren't inherently good or bad. It's the people and the structure that matter, right? Aviation history from the Wright brothers onward shows what happens when transparency disappears. So before pursuing any off-market opportunity, you should ask yourself, one, who's representing whom? And who's looking out for me? And who am I buying from? And what does the data say about the fair market value, right? And then finally, what protections are in place to safeguard me? Because, again, we all talk about this like it's some magic wand, the court of law. It doesn't work the way people think. It's costly to sue. It's time-consuming to sue. There's no guarantees or outcome, right? The cheapest path up front often becomes the most expensive. A good broker will save you money. He or she will reduce risk, and they'll get you the right airplane. A bad deal costs you more than you can imagine. So, I'm Jason Zilberbrand. I'm president of VREF. I'm an ASA appraiser. I'm someone who has seen the good, the bad, and the ugly side of this industry up close. I want to thank you for listening to episode 7. I hope you're enjoying this podcast. If you've enjoyed, please subscribe, leave us a review, share it with someone who's shopping for an aircraft. It might just save them a fortune. Until next time, fly safe and stay smart. This is the truth about the market. You can find past episodes, white papers, and market reports at VREF.com. And if you like today's discussion, check out our latest webinar with the ASA Chicago chapter. We will be releasing it live in the next month. Don't miss our next deep dive. Follow the truth about the market wherever you listen, and grab the latest VREF data at VREF.com.